Hello, and welcome to the Sleepless Storyteller, where the candles burn low, the wind moves softly beyond the walls, and history is told one quiet story at a time. I'm glad you're here tonight. In this video, we'll be traveling back to medieval Europe, to a season that was far colder, darker, and more unforgiving than most of us can easily imagine. A world without central heating, without electric light, without supermarkets, warm showers, weather apps, or an easy way to replace food once the stores of autumn had run out. A world where winter was not just a season to endure, but a season to survive. Before we begin, make yourself comfortable. Let your head rest fully into the pillow. Allow your shoulders to drop. Take one slow, deep breath in and release it gently. If your thoughts are still moving quickly tonight, that's all right. You don't need to force them still. Just let the story give your mind somewhere quieter to go. As you listen, imagine the soft flicker of candlelight on stone walls. Imagine a wooden table, a low fire, a cold wind outside, and a family gathered close together, trying to keep as much warmth inside the room as possible. In the modern world, winter can be inconvenient, a little uncomfortable, something we complain about while turning up the heat or wrapping ourselves in another blanket. But for ordinary medieval families, winter could be frighteningly serious. A poor harvest in autumn might mean hunger by January. Wet firewood could mean a freezing night indoors. A sickness, a failed crop, a dead animal, or a broken roof could turn an already difficult season into disaster. And for peasants, laborers, servants, and villagers, there was no easy safety net waiting for them. Tonight we won't be following kings and castles, or knights riding into battle. We'll be following the ordinary people history usually leaves in the background. The people who woke up before sunrise in dark wooden cottages, who wore rough wool and damp boots, who rationed bread, prayed the grain would last and hoped their family could make it to spring. So if you'd like, close your eyes now. Picture a frozen field under a pale moon. Picture frost gathering at the edges of a tiny window. Picture the glow of a hearth, the smell of smoke in the rafters, and the long stillness of a winter night stretching on outside. Tonight, in the Sleepless Storyteller, we'll be drifting into why you wouldn't survive a medieval winter. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the story begin. Why you wouldn't survive a medieval winter, and neither would most kings. Part 1. The illusion of modern warmth. You wake up on a Tuesday morning in January. Your phone reads 6:47 a.m. The weather app helpfully informs you that it's 18 degrees Fahrenheit outside. Feels like 9 with wind chill, and there's a winter weather advisory in effect until noon. You groan, pull your synthetic duvet tighter around yourself, and spend 5 minutes negotiating with your own psychology about whether you can justify working from home today. Eventually, you swing your feet onto the floor, wincing at the cold hardwood, and shuffle to the bathroom. The thermostat is set to 68. Within seconds, the hot water from your shower fills the room with steam. You dress in layers of fleece and merino wool, grab a protein bar from your climate-controlled pantry, and walk to your car, which heats up in under 3 minutes. You drive on roads that have been salted and plowed, past houses with insulated walls and double-pane windows, to an office building with a furnace the size of a small elephant. At lunch, you eat fresh strawberries. In January, you don't think about any of this. You don't have to. That's the miracle of modernity. We have collectively decided that winter is an inconvenience rather than an existential threat. Now, I want you to unlearn everything you know about comfort. I want you to strip away every assumption, every privilege, every technological miracle that you take for granted. I want you to imagine that you wake up one day, not in your bedroom, but in a damp, smoky one-room hovel in rural England. Sometime around the year 1340, you are a peasant. You have never seen a thermometer, but your bones tell you it's well below freezing. There is no thermostat, there is no shower, there is no protein bar, there is no car. The only thing you have is a thin linen tunic, a woolen cloak, so threadbare you can see through it, and the knowledge that winter has just begun, and you will not survive it. Not because you're weak, but because the medieval winter was a predator relentless, patient, and utterly unforgiving. It killed kings. It killed queens. It killed the rich and the poor with equal indifference. And you, my modern friend, wouldn't last a week. Let's start with the cold itself. But not the cold you know. The cold you know is a dry, crisp, almost sterile thing a few degrees below freezing, a few inches of snow, a bite in the air that makes you reach for a scarf. The cold of the medieval winter was something else entirely. It was damp. It was invasive. It got into your bones and stayed there, and it lasted for months. We're not talking about a 2-week cold snap. We're talking about a season that could stretch from October to April, with temperatures that regularly dipped to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, with snowdrifts that buried entire villages, with rivers that froze so solid you could walk across them from one country to another. Now, let's talk about the science of what that cold does to the human body. When your core temperature drops below 95 degrees Fahrenheit, you enter a state of hypothermia. At first, you shiver uncontrollably. That's your body's desperate attempt to generate heat through muscle contractions. Then the shivering stops. That's the dangerous part. That means your body has given up and your blood is rushing away from your extremities to protect your vital organs. Your fingers and toes go numb. They turn white, then blue, then black. That's frostbite. If you're lucky, you'll just lose a few digits. If you're unlucky, you'll lose your hands, your feet, your nose, your ears, and then you'll die either from infection or from the cold itself. This process takes hours in the modern world. In the medieval world, it took minutes, because you were already wet, because your clothes were already inadequate, because there was no shelter, no warmth, no rescue. Part 2. The architecture of misery. Now let's talk about where you'd live. The typical medieval peasant dwelling was a structure called a crack house, a single room about 20 feet long by 15 feet wide, built around a framework of curved wooden beams that met at the roof. The walls were wattle and daub, a lattice of woven sticks covered in a mixture of clay, straw, horsehair, and yestung. This material was surprisingly sturdy when dry, but when damp, which it was, constantly it became a sponge that drew moisture into the home. The floor was packed earth, which sucked the warmth from your feet like a vampire. The roof was thatch, bundles of reeds or straw layered over the rafters. Thatch could last decades, but it also leaked, rotted, and became a haven for rats, insects, and the occasional bird that would nest in the eaves and drop fleas into your hair while you slept. And here's the kick of the half. In a medieval peasant home, the hearth wasn't a fireplace. It was a simple stone-lined pit in the center of the room, directly on the dirt floor. The fire burned in the middle of a living space, with the smoke rising to the roof and filtering out through the thatch. This meant a few things. First, the fire was extremely inefficient. Most of the heat went straight up and out, warming the birds and the eaves far more than it warmed you. Second, the smoke permeated everything: your clothes, your bedding, your food, your lungs. Everyone who lived in a medieval home had chronic respiratory issues. They coughed constantly, their eyes watered, and they died young, not just from the cold, but from the smoke itself. Third, the fire was dangerous. A stray ember could ignite the turning your home into a funeral pyre in minutes. And there was no fire department. There was no insurance. You just watched your entire life burn to the ground, and then you froze to death in the ruins. But you couldn't sleep near the fire because the smoke would choke you. So you slept as close as you could, maybe 4 or 5 feet away, on a straw pallet on the dirt floor. You'd wrap yourself in whatever you had. A thin wool blanket if you were lucky, or just your cloak. The temperature in the room would be maybe 40 degrees. Maybe. And you'd wake up every few hours shivering to add another log to the fire. You'd have to get up, walk across the freezing dirt floor, tend the flames, and then crawl back to your bed, which had cooled in the meantime. This was your existence every single night for months on end. You'd never get a full night's sleep. You'd never feel truly warm. You'd never know what it was like to be comfortable. Now, you might think, but surely the nobles had it better. And you'd be partly right. A medieval nobleman's castle was a vast improvement over a peasant's hovel. It had actual fireplaces, large stone structures built into the walls, with chimneys that drew the smoke out of the room. The fireplaces could burn massive logs, generating significant heat. The walls were thick stone, offering protection from the wind. The floors were stone or wood, not dirt. There were tapestries on the walls, not for decoration but for insulation, trapping a layer of air between the stone and the room. The nobleman had multiple rooms, each with its own hearth, so he could move to the warmest one as the day progressed. He had furs. He had heavy woolen garments. He had servants to tend the fires day and night. But here's the thing, castles were also freezing. Stone, as any architect will tell you, is an excellent conductor of cold. The walls were uninsulated, so the cold from the outside seeped in relentlessly. The windows were tiny slits, designed for defense rather than light, and they let in icy drafts. The great hall, where the nobleman and his household gathered, could be 100 feet long with ceilings 30 feet high, and it was impossible to heat. The fire roared at one end, but the people at the other end were shivering. The nobleman's private chamber was warmer, but still far from comfortable, maybe 50 degrees on a good day. 55 he burned enough wood. And here's the really sobering fact. The nobleman was still cold. He still suffered. His hands exposed to write letters or handle documents would go numb. His joints ached. His servants who brought him food and tended the fires died of exposure and pneumonia regularly. The nobleman didn't survive medieval winter because of his wealth. He survived longer. A peasant died at 35. A nobleman died at 50. But they both died of the same things: disease, malnutrition, and the cold. Even the king, sitting in his palace with all the furs and fires in the realm, was never truly warm. His breath fogged in the air as he issued decrees. His ink froze in the pot. His royal cooks had to chisel his meat out of the ice in the cellar. Part 3. The hunger that never ends, but let's move beyond the cold. Because even if you could somehow stay warm and you couldn't, winter had another, more insidious weapon: hunger. You see, modern people have absolutely no concept of what it means to be truly hungry. We know hungry as a mild, inconvenient sensation, easily cured by a granola bar or a trip to the fridge. We know hungry as the feeling you get when you skip lunch and your stomach growls. We do not know hungry as a constant, gnawing, aching void in your belly that never, ever goes away. We do not know hungry as the feeling of your body eating its own muscles, consuming its own fat, desperately trying to keep you alive for just one more day. We do not know hungry as a 6-month ordeal that only ends when you die or when the spring thaw finally arrives. Whichever comes first. Consider the mathematics of medieval agriculture. You are a peasant farmer. You have a small plot of land, maybe 15 acres. You practice subsistence farming, growing wheat, barley, and oats. You also have a few animals: a cow, a pig, some chickens. You work the land with a wooden plow pulled by an ox. You harvest by hand, with a scythe. And you have to produce enough food not just for yourself and your family, but for the lord who owns the land, who takes a portion of your harvest as rent. You also need to save enough seed grain for next year's planting. In a good year, you plant a bushel of wheat and harvest about 4 bushels. That's a ratio of 1:4. By contrast, modern agriculture yields ratios of 1:30 or even 1,060. That's how much more efficient we are. We produce 30 times the food per unit of seed. The medieval farmer produced 4. So you've got 4 bushels of wheat. 1 bushel goes to the lord. 1 bushel goes into the ground for next year's seed. You're left with 2 bushels. That 2 bushels has to feed you, your wife, and your children for an entire year. It has to be enough to make bread, porridge, and whatever else you can invent to stave off starvation. And it's not. It's never enough. So you supplement. You eat turnips, carrots, and cabbage from your garden. You keep your cow for milk, your chickens for eggs. You slaughter the pig in the fall, preserve the meat with salt, and hope it doesn't spoil. You forage for wild greens, mushrooms, and berries when they're in season. You fish the river if you can. You trap rabbits and hares. You do whatever you can to stave off the inevitable. And then comes winter. In November, the harvest is complete, the garden is dead. The chickens stop laying eggs. The cow goes dry. The preserved meat is starting to go bad. And you have to make everything last until April or May 5, maybe 6 months. This is the hungry gap. This is the period when your carefully hoarded supplies dwindle day by day, and you watch your children's faces grow thinner. Their eyes grow larger. Their skin grows sallow. You reduce your portions. You water down the porridge. You stretch the bread with bark and acorn flour. You scrape mold off the salted meat and eat it anyway, hoping it won't make you too sick. You cut out 1 meal a day, then 2. You sit in the dark and the cold, and you wonder how many more days you have left. And then the desperate measures begin. You start with the root vegetables, the turnips and carrots that you stored in the cellar. They're shriveled and soft, but you eat them anyway. Then you move to the livestock. You slaughter the cow, your last source of milk, because she's too thin to give milk anyway, and she needs to eat the hay you don't have. You kill the chickens one by one to make a thin broth that tastes like death but keeps you alive a little longer. You kill the horse if you have one, though that means you won't be able to plow in the spring. The horse meat is stringy and tough, but it's meat, and you're so hungry you don't even taste it anymore. When the animals are gone, you start on the inedible. You grind up tree bark and mix it with a little flour to make a bread that is more wood than grain. You collect acorns, soak them to remove the better tannins, and eat them boiled. You find wild sorrel and nettles, whatever green things you can scavenge. You look at the leather of your shoes and wonder if you could eat them. Some people did. You look at your neighbors and wonder if they have anything left to share. They don't. They're just as hungry as you are. And then for many, the unthinkable happens. The winter 1315-1316 was one of the worst in recorded history. A volcanic eruption in the Pacific had caused global cooling, and Europe was plunged into a great famine that lasted 2 full years. The chroniclers of the time wrote that people ate the bark of trees, the grass of the fields, the roots of the earth. They ate their dogs and cats. They ate their horses and cows and pigs. And then, when there was nothing left, they ate their dead. There are documented accounts, not rumors, not legends, but official chronicles from monasteries and towns of people resorting to cannibalism. In one town in France, a man was executed for cooking and eating his own children. In another, a mother killed and ate her own baby because she was too weak to find any other food. The chroniclers wrote of this, not with horror, but with matter-of-fact resignation, as if they were recording the weather. This is what winter did. It made people eat their own children, and then it made them die anyway. Part 4, the disease that lurks in the dark. Now I want to talk about disease. Because if the cold and the hunger don't kill you, and they probably will, there's a whole army of bacteria, viruses, and parasites waiting to finish the job. And here's the ironic part. The cold actually helped them. You'd think that freezing temperatures would kill off disease-causing germs, and you'd be right outside. But inside, in those cramped, smoky, unventilated medieval hovels, the conditions were perfect for the spread of illness. People lived in close quarters with each other and with their animals, the goat, the chickens, the pig, all sharing the same roof, sleeping in the same space, breathing the same air. This was a paradise for pathogens. Flu viruses, which we now battle with vaccines and antiviral drugs, swept through communities like wildfire. Tuberculosis, the White Death, thrived in the damp, poorly ventilated interiors, slowly consuming people's lungs over years and years. And pneumonia, the old man's friend, they called it, was the leading cause of death, because a bad cold could quickly turn into a chest infection, and a chest infection could turn into a fatal pneumonia within days. And let's not forget the parasites. The medieval world was crawling with them. Fleas, lice, and ticks lived in the clothing and bedding. Intestinal worms, hookworms, tapeworms, roundworms infested the food and water. Malaria was endemic in parts of Europe. The mosquitoes thriving in the marshes and wetlands. The fleas and the rats were carriers of the bubonic plague, which arrived in Europe in 1347 and killed 1/3 of the population. But even before that, there were pestilences, local outbreaks of fever and dysentery that wiped out whole villages. And winter made everything worse. People were malnourished, their immune systems weakened by months of inadequate food. They were cold and stressed, their bodies constantly fighting to stay warm. They had open sores and wounds that wouldn't heal. A simple scratch could become a life-threatening infection. A minor cough could become a death sentence. Consider the children. Infant mortality was appallingly high. Between 30 and 50% of all children died before their 5th birthday. In winter, those numbers spiked. Babies with their tiny bodies and developing immune systems were particularly vulnerable. They'd be swaddled in wet rags, sleeping in the cold, breathing in the smoke, drinking watery milk from malnourished mothers. They died of whooping cough, of diphtheria, of croup, of simple fevers that would be cured by a $10 bottle of antibiotics today. They died of failure to thrive, which is a medical term for we just don't know why they died, but they did. And their parents would watch them die, helpless. And then they'd carry their tiny bodies to the churchyard, where the ground was too frozen to dig a grave. So the bodies would be stacked in the church itself, waiting for the spring thaw. The church would be filled with the dead. It would be filled with the smell of death. And the families would sit in the pews shivering, surrounded by the corpses of their own children. And they'd pray to a God who seemed to have abandoned them. Part 5. The Psychological Abyss. And now I want to talk about something that historians rarely mention. The psychological toll. Imagine you're a peasant in that same one-room hovel. It's February. The sun sets at 4 in the afternoon. If you're lucky enough to have a clear sky, which you rarely are. The days are grey, wet, and miserable. There's nothing to do. You can't work in the fields. You can't socialize because your neighbors are all cooped up in their own hovels. You can't read because you're illiterate. You can't even look out the window because your house doesn't have one. You're trapped in a single room with your family, in the dark for 16 hours a day. And that's just the beginning. The darkness was relentless. Candles were expensive, made from beeswax or tallow. They burned down quickly and had to be replaced. A single candle might cost you a day's wages, so you didn't use them unless you absolutely had to. Instead, you sat in the dark. You talked to your family. You told stories. You sang songs. You tried to pass the time, but the darkness pressed in on you, heavy and suffocating. It seeped into your soul. It made you feel like the world had ended, like the sun would never return, like you were already dead and just waiting for your body to catch up. And the boredom. Oh, the boredom. You'd spend hours doing nothing, just sitting, staring, waiting. Your mind, starved of stimulation, would turn in on itself. You'd dwell on every slight, every fear, every worry. You'd replay the year's tragedies over and over. You'd worry about your children. You'd worry about the spring planting. You'd worry about the Lord's tax collector. You'd work yourself into a frenzy of anxiety, and there was nothing to distract you. No television, no radio, no internet, no books, just the endless, monotonous drip of water through the thatch, the crackle of the fire, and the sound of your own breathing. And then the madness would begin. The records from medieval monasteries are filled with accounts of monks going mad during the winter. They'd become agitated, violent, or catatonic. They'd attack each other over imagined slights. They'd have visions and hallucinations. They'd strip off their clothes and run outside into the snow, screaming. The monks called it the winter madness, but we know it now as seasonal affective disorder, a form of depression triggered by the lack of sunlight. But the monks didn't have a name for it. They didn't understand it. They just saw their brothers losing their minds, and they prayed for their souls, and the peasants fared no better. They didn't have the intellectual framework to understand depression. They thought the madness was demons or witchcraft or punishment from God. They'd drive the afflicted out into the snow, hoping the cold would cleanse them, or they'd tie them up and wait for spring. Sometimes, when the madness was too great, they'd kill them. It was seen as a mercy. Part 6. The kings and their frozen thrones. Now, let's talk about the kings. Because you might be thinking, sure, the peasants had it rough, but the kings, they must have had it good. Right. Wrong. So wrong. The kings suffered too. They suffered in ways that were, in some respects, worse than the peasants, because they knew what they were missing. They knew what comfort felt like. They had tasted luxury, and now, in the depths of winter, they were cold and hungry, just like everyone else. Henry III of England, who ruled from 1216 to 1272, was a man who loved comfort. He had a palace in Westminster with huge fireplaces, tapestries on the walls, and furs on the beds. And still he complained about the cold. His chroniclers note that he spent most of the winter months in his private chamber, huddled by the fire, refusing to attend council meetings or courts. He would send his servants to fetch him food and wine, and he would eat alone, wrapped in his furs, his fingers too numb to write letters. In 1258, during the Great Famine, he was forced to eat the same gruel as his subjects, because there was no other food to be had. He wept. He wept openly in front of his court because he was hungry and cold and afraid. And what about the queens? The queen suffered too. Eleanor of Castile, wife of Edward the Fide, was so sensitive to the cold that she had to wear fur-lined robes, even in the summer. In the winter, she would not leave her bedchamber. She had braziers pans of glowing coals placed all around her bed, and she would lie in the center of a circle of heat, her maids and attendants, and she would still shiver. She had her food brought to her, and she would eat it in bed, like an invalid. She died in 1290, probably from a combination of winter-borne illness and the constant wearing cold. And let's not forget the children. The royal children died too. They died of the same things as the peasants' children: colds, fevers, pneumonia. They died in their gilded cradles, wrapped in silk and velvet, surrounded by doctors and priests, and they died anyway. King John of England, yes, the bad one, the villain of Robin Hood, lost 3 of his children in a single winter. 3. They were buried in the same church and the same week, and the king went mad with grief. He refused to eat. He refused to speak. He sat in his chamber for days, staring at the wall, while snow fell and the temperature dropped. And the kings, unlike the peasants, couldn't just cope. They had to rule. They had to make decisions. They had to sign documents and meet with advisors and negotiate with the nobility, all while freezing, starving, and sick. They had to pretend to be strong, because if the king showed weakness, the nobility would rebel. They had to smile and act as if everything was fine, while their teeth chattered and their hands shook and their children were being buried in the frozen ground. It's a miracle any of them survived at all. Many didn't, and those who did were broken, hollowed out by the long, dark months. Part 7. The Infrastructure of Death. Now let's consider the infrastructure, or rather the complete and total lack of it. Roads in medieval Europe were, for the most part, rutted, muddy tracks that became completely impassable in winter. The Romans had built an extensive network of paved roads, but those had fallen into disrepair centuries earlier. By the medieval period, travel was done mostly by foot or by horse, and in winter, even that was impossible. The roads would turn into bogs of freezing mud, or they'd be buried under 6 feet of snow. Bridges, often made of wood, would be washed away by winter floods or collapse under the weight of ice. Rivers, instead of being obstacles, became roads, sort of. When the rivers froze solid, you could walk across them, but that was dangerous too. The ice wasn't always stable. People fell through, they drowned, they froze to death in the water before they could be rescued, and there was no communication, no weather forecasts, no telephones, no radios. A blizzard would roll in and you wouldn't know it was coming until the snow started falling. You'd be out in the fields or walking to the next village, and suddenly the sky would turn white and the wind would scream and you'd be lost. You'd wander around trying to find shelter and you'd die of exposure within hours. There are countless accounts of people, entire families, who were found frozen in the snow just a mile from their own homes. They'd gotten disoriented and they'd wandered in circles until they collapsed. And the winter didn't just kill people, it killed the economy. Trade ground to a halt. The markets were empty because no one could bring goods to town. The craftsmen had no materials because the raw materials couldn't be transported. The blacksmith, the carpenter, the weaver, they all sat idle, their hands cold, their bellies empty, waiting for the spring that might never come. And the lords didn't get their rents. The tax collectors couldn't travel. The king's treasury was empty. The whole system, the entire feudal structure that held society together, was paralyzed by the snow. It was, in a way, a temporary apocalypse, a brief annual return to chaos, where the old rules didn't apply and survival was the only law. Part 8. The Winter of 1315, a case study. Let me tell you about one specific winter, the winter of 1315-1316. This is the winter that historians have studied more than any other. It began not with a snowstorm, but with a rainstorm. In the spring and summer of 1315, it rained, and rained, and rained for months. The crops rotted in the fields. The hay was moldy. The grain was so waterlogged that it sprouted before it could be harvested. The harvest was a disaster. People gathered what they could, moldy, watery, barely edible, and stored it in their granaries, hoping it would last through the winter. It didn't. By October, the supplies were already running low, and then the cold came. Not just a little cold, a brutal, bone-deep cold that froze the rivers, killed the livestock, and turned the ground into iron. The Great Famine that followed was one of the worst demographic disasters in European history. The chroniclers of the time wrote of a plague of locusts and a pestilence of the fields. They wrote of mothers abandoning their children, of children abandoned by their parents, of old people found frozen in their beds, of men and women who ate their own dead. the chronicles of the city of Florence, which was wealthy, cosmopolitan, and advanced for its time, recorded that in 1316, the city's officials had to appoint a committee to handle the disposal of corpses because the graveyards were full and the dead were piling up in the streets. The committee, in turn, had to hire a special crew of men to drag the bodies to the river, where they were thrown in to float away. The river, after a while, was filled with corpses. People drank from that river. They drank the water that had been touched by the dead, and they died too. England was hit even harder. The chronicles of the abbeys are filled with desperate entries. This year, there was a great famine in the land. The poor died in the streets. The nobles ate their horses. The king ate his pride. In some villages, the population was reduced by 2/3, not because of a plague, though, that would come later, but simply because there was no food, and the winter just kept going. It snowed in April. It snowed in May. The crops that were planted in the spring froze before they could grow. The famine stretched to 1317, and then 1318, and then, just when people thought it was over, the Black Death arrived in 1347, and the cycle began again. Part 9. The Unforgiving Calendar. Let me give you a sense of the timeline. Modern people think of winter as December, January, and February, maybe a little of November and March at the edges. The medieval winter was longer. It started in October, sometimes September, and it lasted until April, sometimes May. That's 7-8 months of cold and hunger, 7 months of waking up shivering, 7 months of going to bed hungry, 7 months of darkness and damp and the ever-present threat of disease, 7 months of watching your children grow thinner and thinner, your wife grow weaker and weaker, your own body shrink under the weight of starvation. 7 months of your teeth rotting and your skin cracking and your hair falling out. 7 months of just trying to survive until the spring thaw, and knowing in your heart of hearts that even if you did survive, the spring would be no easier, because the spring was mud, and the mud was more work, and the work was more hunger, and the hunger was more death. It never ended. It just kept going year after year until you died and the worms ate you and the next generation took your place. Part 10. The Livestock Catastrophe. Let's talk about the animals in more detail, because the livestock suffered just as much as the humans. In a medieval village, animals were not just a source of food, they were capital. A cow was an investment. A horse was a necessary tool for survival. A pig was a walking pantry. And when winter hit, the animals began to die. First, the old ones. The cows who had given milk for years. The horses who had worked the fields. The pigs who had been fattened for slaughter. They couldn't handle the cold. They couldn't handle the lack of food. They'd lie down in the snow, too weak to get up, and they'd freeze to death. The farmers would find them in the morning, stiff and cold, and they'd weep. Not because they loved the animals, though sometimes they did, but because those animals were their retirement fund, their children's college fund, their insurance against disaster, and now they were gone. And the animals that survived, they didn't produce. The cows stopped giving milk because there was no grass, no hay, no sustenance. The chickens stopped laying eggs. The sheep lost their wool, their coats matted and diseased. The pigs, if they were lucky, were slaughtered for food, but that meant no piglets in the spring. The animals were thin, emaciated, their ribs showing through their mangy coats. They looked like ghosts. They moved like ghosts. They were ghosts, walking in the snow, waiting for the end. And the farmers had to make impossible choices. Do you feed the last of your grain to the animals, or do you save it for your children? Do you slaughter the cow now, or she has a little meat on her bones? Or do you wait and hope she survives the winter and gives milk in the spring? Do you use your horse to pull the plow in the spring? Or do you eat the horse and plow with your own aching back? These were the questions that haunted every farmer every day throughout the long winter. There were no right answers. There were only less terrible ones. Part 11. The Church in the Winter. Now, let's talk about the church. Because if there was one institution that tried to provide comfort during the medieval winter, it was the church. The church was the center of the village, the only building made of stone, the only place with real walls, the only place where you could stand upright and feel something like shelter. The church was warm. Not warm like a modern house, but warm relative to the rest of the world. The church had thick stone walls that held some heat. It had candles that glowed and flickered. It had a priest who could perform the rituals that gave meaning to a meaningless existence. And the church served as a refuge. During the worst winters, the peasants would gather in the church, huddled together for warmth. They'd bring their animals, the surviving ones, and they'd sleep in the pews, wrapped in their cloaks, praying for the winter to end. The priest would hold masses, bless the animals, bless the sick, bless the dying. He'd hear confessions, offer absolution, and perform last rites for those who were about to be buried in the frozen ground. The church was, in a sense, the only source of hope, the only place where you could look at the endless snow and think, God has a plan. This is part of his plan. We will survive this because he wills it. But the church wasn't always a comfort, because the church was also the place where the dead were stored. When the ground was too frozen to dig graves, which it was for months, the bodies would be stacked in the church's crypt, or sometimes in the nave itself. The smell of death would mix with the smell of incense and candle wax. The worshippers would sit with corpses at their feet, breathing in the scent of decay, trying to pray through the nausea, and they would wonder, if only for a moment, if God had abandoned them, if the winter was punishment for some sin they didn't know they'd committed, if the suffering would ever end. Part 12. The Long Night of the Soul. Let me describe a night for you. A typical night. You are a peasant. It's January. The temperature outside is 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside your hovel, it's maybe 35 degrees. The fire is low. You've used most of your wood. Your wife is asleep, wrapped in the only blanket you own. Your children are huddled together trying to share body heat. You're sitting by the fire, feeding it twigs and bark, the last of your fuel. You're hungry, you're so hungry. You haven't had a proper meal in 2 days. You're eating bark bread, which tastes like sawdust and gives you stomach cramps. Your fingers are numb. Your face is numb. You can't feel your toes anymore, and you're afraid to look at them because you suspect they've turned black. And you're afraid. You're so afraid. Afraid of the winter. Afraid of the darkness, afraid of the wolves that howled in the distance, circling the village, waiting for someone to die so they can eat the body, afraid of the other villagers who might murder you for a piece of bread, afraid of the Lord's men who might come to collect the rent you don't have and take your children as payment, afraid of your own mind, which is starting to play tricks on you. You see shapes in the shadows, you hear voices in the wind. You think you see your dead mother standing in the corner, beckoning you to come with her. And you wait. You wait for the sun. You wait for the spring. You wait for the end. And you're not sure which one will come first. Part 13. The nobles went through a different kind of hell. Now, let's return to the nobles. Because their suffering was different, but no less real. The nobleman had money. He had resources. He had servants and advisors and doctors. And yet, in the depths of winter, he was just as trapped as the peasant. His castle, for all its stone walls and roaring fires, was a prison. The snowdrifts around it were higher than a man. The roads were impassable. The supplies were running low. The servants were dying of the cold. The nobleman's family was sick. And the nobleman himself was scared not of the cold or the hunger, but of the people. Because the people, when they got desperate enough, did desperate things. There are accounts from the medieval chronicles of nobles being murdered by their own servants. Not because the servants were evil, but because they were desperate. The nobleman had food, the nobleman had warmth, and the servants, they saw their own children starving. They saw their own mothers freezing, and they thought, if I kill the nobleman, I can take his food, his fire, his furs. I can save my children. I can save my mother. It's a sin, but I'll do it anyway. And they did. They killed their lords. They killed the bishops. They killed the priests. They killed anyone who stood between them and survival. The winter was a great leveler. It made everyone equal. It made everyone a killer. And the nobles, knowing this, lived in constant fear. They locked their doors. They posted guards. They slept with weapons under their pillows. They ate small portions, trying to make their food last, because they knew that when it was gone, their servants would turn on them. They lived in the cold, in the dark, surrounded by people who hated them, and they waited for the thaw. It was, in its own way, a more horrible existence than the peasants, because the peasant had nothing to lose. The nobleman had everything, and he was terrified of losing it. Part 14. The women who kept everything together. And now, I want to talk about the women, because the women of the medieval winter were the true unsung heroes. They were the ones who kept the households running. They were the ones who tended the fires, who cooked the meager meals, who nursed the sick, who comforted the dying. They were the ones who, when the food ran out, found ways to stretch it further. They were the ones who ground the bark into flour, who boiled the leather into soup, who made the impossible, day after day, with no hope of reward. The women also bore the greatest burden of grief. They were the ones who lost children, who lost husbands, who lost parents. They were the ones who had to carry the bodies to the church, who had to wash the dead, who had to dress them for burial in the frozen ground. They were the ones who had to tell the other children, the surviving ones, that their brother, their sister, their father was gone. They were the ones who had to keep going, even when there was no reason to go on. And the women were the ones who made the winter bearable. They told stories. They sang songs. They kept the traditions alive. They taught their children to pray, to hope, to believe that the spring would come. They were the heart of the community, the light in the darkness, the reason that people didn't just give up and die. The chroniclers of the time rarely mentioned the women. They were invisible to history, but they were the ones who survived, and they were the ones who made survival possible. Part 15. The children who died, and the children who lived. Let me tell you about the children. The children of the medieval winter were, in many ways, the most tragic figures. They were innocent. They didn't understand why they were cold. They didn't understand why they were hungry. They didn't understand why their brothers and sisters were dying. They just knew that they hurt, that they were scared, that their parents couldn't help them, and they died in droves. The infant mortality rate was bad enough in the summer. In the winter, it was catastrophic. A whole generation of children was decimated, leaving behind a community of adults who had lost everything, and the children who survived were scarred. They'd seen things that no child should see. They'd watched their siblings starve to death. They'd held their mothers as they died of fever. They'd eaten bark and tree roots and leather, anything to stay alive. They grew up with a hollowness in their souls, a permanent shadow behind their eyes. They grew up with a knowledge of death that was far too intimate, far too personal. They grew up to be the survivors of the winter, the ones who would rebuild the village, who would plant the crops, who would face the next winter and the one after that, knowing that the horror was never really over. But here's the thing. The children who survived became incredibly resilient. They had to be. They'd faced the worst the world could throw at them, and they'd come through it. They were tough in a way that we moderns can barely imagine. They could work from dawn to dusk. They could endure hunger and cold and pain without complaint. They could watch their loved ones die without falling apart. They were the survivors, the ones who carried on, the ones who kept the human race going through the darkest times. And they deserve our respect. They deserve our gratitude. Because if it weren't for them, if it weren't for those resilient children who endured the medieval winter, we wouldn't be here today. Part 16. The animals in the snow. Let's talk more about the animals, because they were more than just livestock. They were companions. In the medieval world, a man and his horse were partners. A family and their cow were bonded. The animals were part of the family, and when they died, it was a death in the family. And in the winter, the animals died in droves. They didn't just die of hunger and cold. They died of neglect, because the farmers were too weak to care for them. They died of disease, because the conditions were so unsanitary. They died of wolves and wild animals, because the farmers couldn't protect them. And when the animals died, the farmers didn't waste them. They used every part. The meat was eaten. The hide was made into clothing, or into shoes, or into roof repairs. The bones were made into tools or broken down for their marrow. Even the manure, frozen solid, was saved and used as fuel or as fertilizer in the spring. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was thrown away. The cycle of life and death was so tightly intertwined that it was almost impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. And the farmers mourned their animals. There are accounts from the chronicles of peasants weeping for their horses, of children crying for their pigs, of families holding funerals for their cows. The animals were not just property. They were partners, friends, family. And when they were gone, the farmers were left with nothing but the endless, snow-covered fields and the gnawing hunger in their bellies. Part 17. The art of the impossible survival against all odds. Now, let's talk about survival. Because despite everything I've just told you, despite the cold, the hunger, the disease, the darkness, the despair, people did survive. They survived the medieval winter. They survived it year after year, generation after generation. And they did it through a combination of ingenuity, community, and sheer stubborn refusal to die. They developed strategies. They built their homes with the fires in the center, despite the smoke, because they knew it was the only way to get any heat. They stacked the beds high with straw and rags, trying to create a layer of insulation. They slept in piles, sharing body heat. They ate at specific times, conserving their energy. They preserved food with salt and with smoke, storing it in the coolest parts of their homes. They supplemented their diets with anything they could find: tree bark, roots, insects. They were resourceful. They were inventive. They survived through sheer willpower. They also relied on community. The medieval village was a collective organism. People helped each other. They shared food. They shared firewood. They shared labor. When one family's home was destroyed, the others helped rebuild it. When one family's children were sick, the others helped nurse them. The village was a safety net, a web of mutual support that made survival possible. The winter was the crucible that tested the community, and for those who survived, the community became stronger, more tightly bonded, more resilient, and there was hope. The spring always came. It came late, it came slowly, but it came. The snow eventually melted. The rivers eventually thawed. The green shoots eventually pushed through the frozen ground, and the people, the survivors, would emerge from their hovels, blinking in the sunlight, and they'd plant the crops, and they'd start the cycle anew. They'd face the next winter with the knowledge that they'd survived the last one. They'd face death with the knowledge that life was on the other side. Part 18. The Legacy of the Winter. And that's the thing, the medieval winter didn't just kill. It shaped the people. It shaped the society. It shaped the culture. The medieval mindset was forged in the crucible of the winter. People were fatalistic because they'd seen so much death. They were religious because they needed something to believe in. They were communal because they knew they couldn't survive alone. They were resilient because they'd had to be. And the winter shaped the economy. The need to store food for the long winter led to the development of granaries, of preservation techniques, of organized agriculture. The need to create warm clothing led to the flourishing of the wool trade, the development of the textile industry, the creation of the guilds. The need for firewood led to the management of forests, to the development of sustainable practices, to the creation of laws around resource use. The winter was the engine that drove medieval society. It was the challenge that demanded innovation. It was the enemy that forced adaptation. And the winter shaped the geography. The north was different from the south. The coastal regions were different from the inland areas. The places where the winter was milder, the Mediterranean, the warmer valleys thrive. The places where the winter was brutal, the highlands, the steppes, the mountains struggled. The geography of Europe was, in a sense, a reflection of the winter. The places that could survive the winter were the places that prospered. The places that couldn't were the places that faded. Part 19, the final winter. Let me tell you about the final winter. The winter that ended the medieval world. It wasn't a single winter. It was a series of them. The winter of 1347 to 1348 was the first year of the Black Death. The winter of 1350 to 1351 was the second wave. The winter of 1361 to 1362 was the third. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed hope. It killed the faith that the winter would ever end. It killed the belief that there was any meaning to the suffering. And the winter of the plague was worse than any other, because the plague didn't just take the old and the weak. It took the young and the strong. It took the children. It took the mothers. It took the fathers. It took the priests. It took the kings. It was a winter that never ended, a plague that never stopped, a death that was always present. The chroniclers of the time wrote of villages that were completely depopulated, of cities where the bodies piled up in the streets, of a world that had been destroyed. The Black Death, combined with a relentless winter, brought the medieval world to its knees. But even then, the survivors carried on. They rebuilt, they replanted, they regrouped. They looked at the devastated world around them and decided that life, even in its most miserable form, was worth living. They had been through the worst. They would survive the rest. And they did. Part 20. The lesson of the snow. So, here's the lesson of the medieval winter. It's not a lesson about suffering. It's not a lesson about death. It's a lesson about survival. It's a lesson about what people can endure, what people can overcome, what people can survive. The medieval people, the peasants, the nobles, the children, the animals, they faced a brutal, unforgiving world, and they survived. They survived through ingenuity and community, through hope and stubbornness, through love and faith. They survived because they had no other choice. And you, modern reader, you've never faced that. You've never faced the cold that kills. You've never faced the hunger that consumes. You've never faced the darkness that overwhelms. You've never had to dig a grave in frozen ground. You've never had to watch your children starve. You've never had to eat bark and leather to stay alive. You've never had to face the longest night of the soul. You don't know what it means to be truly tested. You don't know what it means to truly survive. But you could, if the world changed, if the climate shifted, if the economy collapsed, if the modern infrastructure failed. You could find yourself in a winter like the medieval one, and you'd have to face it. You'd have to dig deep. You'd have to find the strength you didn't know you had. You'd have to rely on community, on resourcefulness, on hope. You'd have to be like the medieval peasants, resilient, ingenious, stubborn. You'd have to survive. But the difference is, the medieval peasants knew how. They had centuries of experience, they had traditions, they had skills. We, with our modern conveniences, have forgotten how. We've forgotten the skills of food preservation. We've forgotten the art of making warm clothing. We've forgotten how to build a shelter that can withstand the cold. We've forgotten how to forage, how to hunt, how to survive. We're soft. We're weak. We're vulnerable. And if a medieval winter hit us today, we'd be utterly helpless. We'd die. We'd die in droves. We'd die in the cold, in the hunger, in the dark. Part 21. The unbearable weight of daily survival. Let's bring this down to the granular level. Let's talk about the daily logistics of a single day in a medieval winter. You wake up before dawn, not because you want to, but because the cold has seeped into your bones and made sleep impossible. You're shivering, your mouth is dry, your stomach aches with hunger. You look around the room and see your family, your wife, huddled under the thin wool blanket, her face thin and gaunt. Your children, 2 of them, their breath misting in the frigid air. You have 3 children, you remind yourself. The oldest died last week. You try not to think about it. You crawl out of the straw pallet and walk to the hearth. The fire is dead. The ashes are cold. You need to light it, but you have no kindling. You have no flint. You have to use the embers from the last fire, which you carefully buried in the ashes, but they've gone cold. You need to find another fire. You wrap yourself in your cloak and step outside. The cold hits you like a physical blow. The snow is piled high around the house. The sky is gray. The sun's still hours from rising. You walk to your neighbor's hovel, a few hundred feet away, and knock on the door. No answer. You knock again. Still no answer. You push the door open and peer inside. The fire is dead. The family is dead. They've all frozen to death overnight. You don't feel much. You've seen this before. You take some embers from their cold hearth, carefully wrapped in a cloth, and you go home, back in your hovel. You coax the embers back to life. You add twigs, then small branches, then logs. The fire crackles and sputters, and you feel a little warmth. But the warmth is temporary. The logs won't last. You're running out of wood. You've already burned all your furniture except the bed. Soon you'll have to burn the bed. And then you'll sleep on the frozen floor. And then you have no choice but to burn the roof beams, and then the house will collapse, and then you freeze. You make breakfast. Breakfast is a thin porridge of barley meal and water, with a little salt for flavor. You divide it among your family. Everyone gets a small bowl. It's not enough. It's never enough. But it's something. You eat slowly, trying to make it last. You try to talk. You try to be cheerful. You try to give your children hope, but you can't. You're too tired. You're too hungry. You're too scared. And then you have to decide what to do today. You could try to find more wood, but the forest is far and the snow is deep. You could try to trap something, but you've already eaten all the animals in the village. You could beg, but no one has anything to give. You could pray, but you've been praying for months, and God hasn't answered, so you do nothing. You just sit by the fire, feeding it twigs, waiting for the sun to set, waiting for the night, waiting for the next day. You do this for months. This is your life. This is your existence. This is the medieval winter. Part 22. The death of the season. How spring finally comes. And then, one day, you hear it. It's faint at first, so faint you think you've imagined it, but then it comes again, a drip, drip, drip. The snow on the roof is melting. The sun is higher in the sky. The air is still cold, but it's not as bitter. The world is waking up. The winter is dying, and you feel something you haven't felt in months. You feel hope, the hope that, against all odds, you might survive. The hope that the spring will come, and with it, new crops, new food, new life. The hope that a long, dark nightmare is finally over, and you go outside and you look at the field that was once your farm. The snow is patchy now, revealing the ground beneath. The ground is hard and frozen, but it's starting to soften, and you know with a certainty that comes from years of experience, that soon you'll be able to plow, soon you'll be able to plant, soon you'll be able to grow. And you go back inside, and you tell your wife, you tell your children, their faces light up. They smile for the first time in months, and you all hold hands, and you pray, and you cry, and you laugh. The laughter is strange. It's been so long since anyone laughed. But it's real. It's the laughter of people who survived. It's the laughter of people who endured the worst the world could throw at them and came out the other side. Part 23. The cycle begins again, but the laughter fades. The spring comes, and with it comes work. You plow the fields. You plant the crops. You pray for rain. You pray for sun. You pray for a good harvest. And you do it all knowing that the winter is coming. It's always coming. It's the great constant of your life. You can never escape it. You can only prepare for it. And you do. You build your granary. You stockpile your wood. You salt your meat. You preserve your vegetables. You do everything you can to survive the next winter. And when it comes, as it always does, you're ready. Not as ready as you'd like, but ready enough. You've been through it before. You know the drill. You know the cold. You know the hunger. You know the darkness. You know the death. And you know that you'll survive. Because that's what you do. You survive. You survive because you have to. You survive because the alternative is unthinkable. You survive because, in the end, that's all you can do. That's all anyone can do. Part 24. The cold within. And here's the final, most haunting thought. The medieval winter never really ended. For the people who lived through it, it became a part of them. It changed their DNA. It changed their psyche. It changed their culture. The winter was in their bones, in their blood, in their souls. They carried it with them, always. They were the children of the winter. They were forged in its crucible. And we, their descendants, we carry that winter too. It's in our genes. It's in our stories. It's in our fears. It's in our dreams. The winter is part of us, whether we know it or not. It shaped us. It made us who we are. So the next time you complain about a cold day that wouldn't even register on the medieval scale, remember what it was like. Remember the cold that killed. Remember the hunger that consumed. Remember the darkness that overwhelmed. Remember the children who died. Remember the mothers who mourned. Remember the fathers who fought. Remember the winter that made them who they were. And be grateful. Be grateful that you live in a world where winter is just an inconvenience, not a death sentence. Be grateful that you've never had to face the frozen horror of the medieval winter. And be humble, because you, like the kings and peasants of old, are fragile. You too would be broken by the winter. You too would be forgotten by history. You too would be just another corpse in the snow. Part 25, the final word. So, why would you survive a medieval winter? Because you don't know how. You don't have the skills. You don't have the resilience. You don't have the community. You don't have the faith. You don't have the hope. You have comfort. But comfort is a thin armor against the cold. You have plenty, but plenty is a fragile shield against the hunger. You have light, but light is a fleeting comfort against the darkness. The medieval people, the peasants, the nobles, the kings, they survived because they had to. They survived because they were forged in the winter. They survived because the winter was their teacher, their enemy, and their god. And we, their descendants, have forgotten the lessons. We've forgotten how to survive. We've forgotten that the cold is real, that the hunger is real, that the darkness is real. And if the winter came again, if the modern world collapsed, and we were plunged back into the medieval reality, we would die. We would die in droves. We would die in the cold, in the hunger, in the darkness. We would die because we've forgotten. We would die because we're weak. We would die because we've never had to face the winter. But maybe, just maybe, we could learn. Maybe we could rediscover the skills. Maybe we could rebuild the community. Maybe we could find the faith, the hope, the resilience. Maybe we could become the people who survive. Maybe we could become, once again, the children of the winter. It's a hope. It's a fragile hope. As fragile as a candle flame in a blizzard. But it's hope nonetheless. And hope is what got the medieval people through. Hope is what got them through the long, dark nights. Hope is what got them through the hunger, the disease, the death. Hope is what made them survive. And perhaps if the winter comes again, hope will be what makes us survive too. Part 26, a note on the historical records. Before I finish, I want to leave you with a thought about the historical record. We have chronicles, we have documents, we have letters from the medieval period. And in those documents we see the winter over and over again. The chroniclers write about it with a kind of distant horror, as if they're recording a natural disaster that they barely understand. They write about the cold, the hunger, the disease. They write about the deaths, the funerals, the bodies stacked in the church. They write about the madness, the despair, the loss. And they write about the hope that the spring would come, the hope that the winter would end, the hope that the sun would return. And when you read those chronicles, you realize something. You realize that the winter was not just a season. It was a character. It was a presence. It was a force that shaped history. It was the enemy that tested the human spirit. It was the crucible that forged the medieval world. And you realize too that the winter is still with us. It's still a part of our world. It's still a force that shapes our lives. The climate is changing. The seasons are shifting. And the winter is becoming more extreme. The medieval winter may be behind us, but it's not gone. It's lurking, waiting. It's waiting for us to forget. It's waiting for us to become complacent. It's waiting for us to be weak. And when the winter comes back in all its medieval fury, we will be tested. We will be tested in ways we haven't been tested in centuries. We will be tested by the cold, by the hunger, by the disease. We will be tested by the darkness, the despair, the madness, and we will have to survive. Or we will die. The choice is ours. Part 27, the echo of the frozen bells. And so, we come to the end. We come to the final, quiet, desolate truth of the medieval winter. There is a reason, after all, that so many European fairy tales begin with the words, "Once upon a time, in a great forest, in the dead of winter." There is a reason that winter is associated with death, with stillness, with silence. There is a reason that the winter solstice, the longest, darkest night, was celebrated for millennia. It was the death of the year. It was the end of the cycle. It was the point at which life hung by the thinnest thread, and the only certainty was that everything would end. But the solstice also marked the turning point. The days would start to lengthen. The sun would return. The light would come back. The winter would end, and life would begin again. That is the lesson of the medieval winter. That is the legacy of the frozen times. That is the truth that still echoes down the centuries, from the frozen villages of the 14th century to the climate-controlled apartments of the 21st. The winter is brutal. It is merciless. It is an unrelenting enemy that takes everything it can from you. But it is not the end. It is never the end. The spring always comes. The sun always returns. Life always finds a way. So, in the end, the question is not whether you would survive a medieval winter. The question is whether you would have the courage, the strength, the hope to keep going even when survival seems impossible. The question is whether you would be willing to face the darkness with a candle in your hand, even when the candle is burning low. The question is whether you would be willing to endure the cold, the hunger, the disease, the madness, and still believe that the sun would return. That is the question. And the answer, my modern friend, is entirely up to you. The frozen bells of the medieval churches have fallen silent. The voices of the chroniclers have faded. The bones of the dead have turned to dust. But the winter is still out there. It's always out there. It's waiting for the moment when we forget. And when that moment comes, when the modern world collapses and we are plunged into the darkness of the medieval winter, we will be tested. We will be tested as our ancestors were tested. We will be tested by the cold, by the hunger, by the disease. We will be tested by the darkness, the despair, the madness, and we will have to prove that we are worthy of survival. The question is, are we? Part 28. The Architecture of Despair. Building for Death. Let us now descend deeper into the physical reality of the medieval winter, because I have barely scratched the surface of what it meant to live in such a world. We've discussed the hovel, the castle, the church, but we haven't truly examined the bones of these structures, the way they were designed with winter in mind and how that design was fundamentally flawed. The medieval builder was not stupid. He knew the winter was coming. He built his structures with the cold in mind, but he was working with limited materials, limited knowledge, and limited resources. And the result was a built environment that was, at best, a temporary reprieve from the elements, and at worst, a death trap. Consider the thatched roof. Thatched roofs were the standard for peasant dwellings for centuries. They were made from reeds, straw, or rushes, carefully layered and secured to the rafters. A well-made thatch roof could last for decades, providing excellent insulation and waterproofing. But thatch had a dark side. It was highly flammable, as I've mentioned, but it also harbored pests. Rats, mice, voles, and insects would nest in the thatch, breeding and multiplying and eventually making their way into the home below. These pests carried disease, fleas, ticks, lice, and they also ate the food stores. A family could lose an entire winter's worth of grain to a single infestation of rats. And thatch had another problem. It rotted. The constant damp of the medieval winter, combined with the smoke from the hearth, would gradually decay the thatch, creating holes and gaps that let in the cold and the wet. The family would have to repair the roof constantly, climbing up on rickety ladders in the freezing rain, patching the holes with new reeds that they'd harvested in the summer. It was a never-ending battle against the elements, a war of attrition that the peasants always lost. The walls, too, were a source of constant misery. Wattle and daub, as I've described, was a mixture of clay, straw, and dung, applied to a framework of woven sticks. When dry, it was surprisingly sturdy, but when wet, it softened and crumbled. The rain and snow would seep through the walls, washing away the daub and exposing the wattle. The family would have to reapply the daub regularly, mixing new batches of clay and dung in the freezing cold, their hands numb and raw. It was a Sisyphean task, endlessly repeated, with no hope of permanent success. And the windows, if you can call them that. Most peasant homes had no windows at all. They had a single opening in the wall, covered with a wooden shutter or a piece of oiled cloth. This was the only source of light, and it was also the only source of ventilation. In the winter, the shutter would be closed, leaving the home in near total darkness. The only light came from the hearth fire, which flickered and sputtered and cast dancing shadows on the walls. The darkness was oppressive, almost suffocating. It pressed in on you from all sides, a physical weight that you could feel on your skin. And the floors, oh, the floors, packed earth, as I've said, which was cold and damp and teeming with insects. The family would spread rushes or straw on the floor, trying to create a barrier between themselves and the dirt. But the rushes would become wet and matted, and they'd have to be replaced regularly. In the meantime, the floor would be a breeding ground for fleas and lice, which would bite and infest the family, spreading disease and causing constant discomfort. Now let's move up the social ladder. The noble's castle was, in theory, a vast improvement. It had stone walls, which were more durable than wattle and daub. It had slate or tile roofs, which were less flammable than thatch. It had glass windows which let in light while keeping out the cold well mostly. The glass was thick and uneven, and it was set in lead frames that warped and cracked in the cold. The windows were also tiny, as I've said, designed for defense rather than illumination. The great hall, where the noble held court, was vast and echoing and impossible to heat. But the castle had another, more insidious problem: the privy. In a medieval castle, the privy was a simple stone seat built into the outer wall. with a shaft that dropped down to the moat or the ground below. In the summer, this was unpleasant but manageable. In the winter, it was a horror. The shaft would freeze, clogging the privy and forcing the noble's household to use chamber pots, which were emptied into the same frozen shaft, creating a solid block of frozen waste that would have to be chiseled out with picks. The smell was atrocious. The sanitation was non-existent, and the disease flourished in that environment. And let's not forget the castle's water supply. Medieval castles were built near rivers or springs, but those water sources often froze in the winter. The inhabitants would have to melt snow or chop through the ice to get water, a laborious, time-consuming process that consumed valuable energy. The water, when they got it, was often contaminated with waste from the privy or from upstream settlements. Dysentery and typhoid were endemic. People died of dehydration and disease long before the cold could kill them. Part 29. The Wardrobe of Misery. Clothing for the dams now. Let's talk about clothing. Because if you think the medieval home was bad, the medieval wardrobe was a study in inadequacy. Modern people, when they think of medieval clothing, tend to imagine something warm and sturdy: woolen tunics, fur-lined cloaks, leather boots. The reality was far grimmer. For the peasant, the basic garment was a linen tunic worn next to the skin. Linen, as I've mentioned, was made from flax, and it had one major drawback. It wickered moisture toward the body. In the winter, when the peasant was sweating from labor or shivering from cold, the linen would become damp and stay damp, drawing heat away from the skin and accelerating hypothermia. The peasant would then layer a woolen tunic over the linen, if he was lucky enough to own one. Wool was warmer and more water-resistant, but it was also expensive. Many peasants had only the linen tunic, which meant they were effectively wearing a wet rag for months on end. And the wool, they did have it, was coarse, scratchy, and felted. It wasn't the soft, comfortable wool we know today. It was a thick, matted fabric that chafed the skin and caused rashes and sores. The peasant would wear it for weeks at a time, rarely washing it because washing took time and energy and required water that was too cold to use. The wool would become infested with lice, which would burrow into the skin and cause intense itching. The peasant would scratch, and the scratching would lead to open wounds, and the wounds would become infected, and the infection would spread, and the peasant would die all because of his clothes. And the shoes. Oh, the shoes. The peasant wore wooden clogs or leather boots if he had them, but leather was expensive and it cracked and split in the cold. The peasant would wrap his feet in rags, trying to add a little insulation, but the rags would become wet and frozen. The peasant's feet would turn white, then blue, then black. He would lose his toes to frostbite, and then his feet, and then he would die. The noble, on the other hand, had access to better clothing. He had furs, fox, rabbit, marten, ermine, which he would line his cloaks and robes with. He had fine wool, woven in Flanders or Italy, which was softer and warmer than the coarse wool of the peasant. He had leather boots lined with fur, which kept his feet dry and warm. He had gloves, hats, and scarves, all made from the finest materials. He looked, in his winter finery, like a figure from a fairy tale. But even the noble's clothing was inadequate. The furs, for all their warmth, were heavy and cumbersome. The wool, for all its softness, was still wool, and it still became damp and cold. The boots, for all their craftsmanship, still leaked when the snow melted. And the noble, like the peasant, couldn't wash his clothes. He could afford to have them cleaned by servants who would beat them with sticks and rinse them in the river. But the cleaning process was laborious and imperfect. The noble's clothes, like the peasant's, became infested with lice. The noble, like the peasant, scratched and bled and died. And there was another problem. The clothing was flammable. In the winter, when the noble sat by the fire, his heavy wool cloak would occasionally catch a spark, and he'd have to be doused with water. If water was available, or beaten with a blanket to put out the flames. People died in clothing fires all the time. They'd be sitting too close to the hearth and a spark would catch their sleeve, and they'd be engulfed in flames before anyone could help them. Part 30. The larder of desperation. Storage and preservation. Now let's talk about food storage, because the medieval winter wasn't just about eating less. It was about eating rotten food. Food preservation was a constant challenge. Without refrigeration, without canning, without vacuum sealing, the medieval people had to rely on a handful of primitive techniques: salting, smoking, drying, and pickling. Salting was the most common method. The peasant would slaughter his pig in the fall and cut it into joints. He'd then pack the meat in salt, layer after layer, in a wooden barrel. The salt would draw off the moisture and preserve the meat, but it also made the meat incredibly salty, almost inedible. The peasant would soak the meat in water before cooking it, trying to leach out some of the salt. But the result was still a salty, tough, stringy mess. And if the salt wasn't completely dry, if it had absorbed moisture from the air, the meat would rot anyway. Smoking was another method. The peasant would hang the meat in the rafters of his home, where the smoke from the hearth would dry and preserve it. But the smoke also imparted a bitter, acrid flavor to the meat, and it was never completely cooked or cured. The meat would still spoil eventually, and the peasant, desperate for food, would eat it anyway, hoping the rancid taste wouldn't make him sick. Drying was used for fruits and vegetables. The peasant would slice apples, pears, or berries and lay them out on racks, in the sun or in the winter near the fire. The heat would evaporate the moisture, creating a shriveled, chewy fruit that could be stored for months. But drying was laborious, and the fruit often molded anyway. The peasant would cut off the moldy parts and eat the rest. Pickling was used for vegetables. The peasant would pack cucumbers, cabbages, or carrots in brine salt water, which would ferment and preserve them. But pickling required salt, which was expensive, and the brine had to be kept at the right temperature. If it froze, the vegetables would turn to mush, and the grain was the most precious commodity of all. The peasant would store his grain in a granary, a separate building on his property. The granary would be raised off the ground to keep the grain dry, and it would have a thatched roof to keep out the rain. But the granary was also a paradise for rats and mice, who would gnaw through the walls and devour the grain. The peasant would have to set traps or bring in cats, but the rodents were relentless. He'd lose a significant portion of his grain every year to pests, and then he'd have to grind the remaining grain by hand, using a quite a heavy stone wheel that he'd turn for hours, grinding the grain into flour. In the winter, the quern was frozen, and the grain was frozen, and the grinding was excruciatingly difficult. And the flour that he ground it, was coarse and dark, filled with chaff and dirt. The peasant would make it into bread, but the bread was heavy and dense, almost like a brick. It would keep for a few days, and then it would go stale, and then it would mold. And the peasant would cut off the mold and eat the rest. Part 31. The Fuel Crisis. Burning the bones of the earth. Now, let's talk about firewood, because you can't have a fire without wood, and you can't have wood without a forest, and you can't have a forest without trees. And trees, in the medieval world, were a finite resource. The peasant needed firewood for cooking and heating. He'd gather deadfall in the autumn, but the deadfall was rarely enough. He'd have to cut live wood from the forest, which was a laborious process. He'd use a hand axe to fell the trees, then a saw to cut them into logs, then a hatchet to split them. In the winter, the wood was frozen, which made it harder to cut. The peasant would work for hours, his hands aching and bleeding, and he'd still only have enough wood for a few days, and the forests weren't free. The lord owned the forest, and the peasant had to pay for the right to cut wood. The lord would charge a fee, a portion of the wood, or a coin, or a promise of labor. And if the peasant couldn't pay, he'd be forbidden from taking wood. He'd be forced to gather deadfall, which was insufficient, or to burn dry dung, which was foul-smelling and inefficient. And the lord, for his part, also needed wood. His castle consumed vast quantities of fuel. The great hall alone burned a cartload of wood every day, a cartload that had to be dragged from the forest by oxen in the snow on rutted roads. The lord would send his serfs into the forest to cut wood, and they'd work for days felling trees and hauling them back. The serfs would be fed barely, and they'd be given their own wood for their own hearths. But it was never enough, and the forests themselves were shrinking. The medieval population was growing and the demand for wood was increasing. The forests were being cleared for farmland, and the remaining trees were being over-harvested. By the late medieval period, parts of Europe were experiencing a wood shortage. The peasant had to travel further and further from his home to find firewood, and he'd spend more and more of his time gathering fuel. The wood that he gathered wasn't dry. It was green, freshly cut, and it burned poorly, producing more smoke than heat. And the peasant, frustrated and exhausted, would burn anything he could find. The furniture, the roof beams, the bones of his animals. and the peat was an alternative. In some parts of Europe, the peasant would cut peat from the bogs, dry it, and burn it as fuel. But peat was heavy and dirty, and it produced a lot of smoke and a lot of ash. The peat fires were smoky and acrid, filling the home with a choking haze that irritated the eyes and lungs. And the peat bogs were often frozen in the winter, making them impossible to cut. Part 32, the forgotten art of winter foraging. Let's talk about foraging, the ancient art of finding food in the wild. Because the medieval peasant didn't just rely on his crops and his animals. He also relied on the wild things, the free things, the things that grew in the forests and fields. In the autumn, the peasant would forage for mushrooms, berries, and nuts. He'd know which mushrooms were safe and which were poisonous, which berries were sweet and which were sour, which nuts were edible and which were bitter. He'd collect them in baskets and store them in his home, supplementing his diet with the wild bounty. But in the winter, the wild bounty was gone. The mushrooms had died, the berries had withered, the nuts had been eaten by the squirrels. So the peasant would turn to other sources. He'd dig for roots, wild carrots, wild parsnips, wild turnips, which would still be in the ground, dormant. He'd peel them and boil them, and they'd be tough and woody, but they'd provide some nutrition. He'd look for cattails in the frozen marshes, the roots, or rhizomes, which could be ground into flour. He'd search for acorns, which had fallen from the oak trees and buried themselves in the leaves. He'd soak the acorns to remove the bitter tannins, and then he'd grind them into a meal that he'd use to stretch his barley flour. He'd also hunt. He'd set snares for rabbits, hares, and squirrels. He'd fish in the frozen rivers and streams, cutting holes in the ice and dangling a line. He'd hunt birds with a bow and arrow, or a slingshot, or his bare hands, though it was hard to be stealthy in the snow. He'd take whatever he could get, and he'd be grateful for it. But the hunting and foraging were dangerous. The forest was full of predators, wolves, bears, wild boars who were also hungry and who would attack a lone peasant if they had the chance. The peasant would go out with a knife or a staff, and he'd hope he didn't encounter anything larger than a rabbit. And if he did encounter something larger, well, he'd die. He'd be torn apart, and his family would wait for him to come home, and he never would. Part 33, the social bond. Community survival now. Let's talk about community. Because the medieval peasant didn't survive alone. He survived as part of a village, a network of families and neighbors who helped each other through the winter. The village was a cooperative enterprise. The peasants would share their resources, firewood, food, tools, labor. When one family's roof collapsed, the others would help rebuild it. When one family's granary was empty, the others would share their grain. When one family's children were sick, the others would help nurse them. The village was a safety net, a mutual aid society, a small-scale welfare state, and the village had a central authority, the lord, or his steward. The lord, for all his faults, had a responsibility to his people. He was supposed to protect them, to keep them safe, to ensure they didn't starve. In the winter, the lord would distribute grain from his own granaries, and he'd give his people wood from his own forests. He'd organize hunting expeditions, and he'd share the meat with everyone. He'd hold festivals and feasts, trying to boost morale. He was, in theory, a provider, but in practice, the lord was often absent. He might be off fighting a war, or attending the king's court, or just lounging in his castle, ignoring the suffering of his people. Or he might be greedy, hoarding his grain and selling it at inflated prices, taking advantage of the shortage. Or he might be incompetent, unable to manage his estate, letting his people starve while he feasted on his own. When the lord was absent or greedy or incompetent, the peasants would have to fend for themselves. They'd have to organize their own relief efforts, pooling their resources and distributing them fairly. They'd have to enforce their own rules, punishing those who hoarded or stole. They'd have to form their own community, a microcosm of society, based on mutual trust and cooperation. And they did. They survived because of each other. They survived because they knew they were all in the same boat, the same leaky, frozen, sinking boat, and they had to row together or drown. Part 34, the winter feast, eating with the dead. But there was another aspect of community, the winter feast. Despite the hunger and cold, the medieval people found reasons to celebrate. Christmas, the winter solstice, Epiphany, these were festivals of light and joy, opportunities to forget the misery and connect with one another. The Lord would host a feast in his great hall, inviting the peasants from the village. He'd serve his best food, roasted meats, fresh bread, spiced wine, and there would be music and dancing and storytelling. The peasants would eat until their bellies were full, and they'd drink until their heads were spinning. For one night, they'd forget the cold and the hunger and the disease. For one night, they'd be happy. And the feast had a deeper meaning. It was a reformation of the social order. The Lord was the provider, the peasant was the recipient, and the feast was a symbol of the bond between them. The Lord was showing off his wealth and power, but he was also showing his generosity and compassion. The peasant, in turn, was showing his loyalty and gratitude. The feast was a ritual, a sacred act of community, and the food was the star. The roasted meats, the fresh bread, the spiced wine, they were luxury, indulgence, abundance. For one night, the peasant could forget that he was starving. For one night, he could pretend that the winter was just a bad dream. For one night, he could hope. But the feast was also tinged with sadness. The peasant would look around at the table and see the empty chairs, the chairs of the dead, the children who had died, the parents who had died, the friends who had died, and he would eat and drink and laugh. But he would also remember. The winter feast was a celebration of life, but it was also a remembrance of death. It was a way of honoring the dead and affirming the living. It was a way of saying, we are still here, we are still fighting, we are still surviving. Part 35, The Children of the Ice. Growing up in the cold. Let's now turn our attention to the children in greater detail, because their experience of the medieval winter was fundamentally different from that of adults. For a child, the winter was not just a hardship. It was a mystery, a nightmare, a world of terror and wonder that shaped their souls for life. Imagine being born in a medieval village. You are born in the spring or summer when the world is green and warm. Your mother wraps you in swaddling clothes strips of linen that keep your arms and legs straight, and you lie in a cradle by the hearth. You are loved, you are fed, you are safe. But then comes your first winter. You are 6 months old, and the world outside is white and cold and terrifying. The wind howls outside your door, and the snow piles up against the walls. Inside, the fire sputters and crackles, and the smoke stings your eyes. Your mother holds you close, trying to keep you warm, but the cold seeps into your bones. You cry. You cry because you're cold, because you're hungry, because you're scared. And your mother cries too, because she can't help you, because she's helpless, because the winter is a monster that she can't defeat. And then, one night, you stop crying. You stop crying because you don't have the strength anymore. Your mother looks down at you and sees that your lips are blue, your skin is pale, your breathing is shallow. She knows what's happening. She knows that you're dying. She holds you tighter, and she rocks you, and she sings to you, and you die in her arms, your eyes open, staring at the darkness. This was the fate of so many medieval children. They died in their first winter, or their second, or their third. They died of the cold, of the hunger, of the disease. They died of neglect, of despair, of broken hearts. They died because the winter was relentless, merciless, and utterly indifferent to their suffering. And the children who survived, they were the lucky ones. They were the ones who, through sheer chance, had stronger immune systems, or better access to food and warmth, or just luckier circumstances. They grew up in the shadow of death, surrounded by the dead, haunted by the memory of siblings and parents who didn't make it, and they grew up with a dark, cold, hard wisdom. They knew that life was fragile. They knew that death was always nearby. They knew that the winter was a predator that could strike at any moment. They grew up with a fatalism that we moderns can barely comprehend. They knew that they couldn't change the world. They couldn't stop the winter, or banish the hunger, or defeat the disease. All they could do was endure. All they could do was survive. Part 36. The Starving Months. When hope fails, there came a point in every medieval winter, usually around February or March, when the food stores were at their lowest and the cold was at its most brutal when hope failed. It was a psychological turning point, a moment when the people stopped believing that the winter would ever end. They look at the snow which was still falling and think, the spring will never come, the sun will never return, this is the end, and then they'd give up. Some would die quietly, lying down in the snow and closing their eyes. Others would go mad, tearing off their clothes and running through the village, screaming at the sky. Others would turn on each other, stealing, fighting, killing. The social order would collapse. The bonds of community would snap, and the village would become a nightmare of violence and despair. The chronicles are filled with accounts of these breakdowns. In 1316, in a village in England, the peasants rose up against their lord, demanding food. When the lord refused, they killed him and his family and burned down his castle. Then they ate the food from his granary, and when that was gone, they ate each other. By the time the spring came, the village was empty. There were no survivors, and the breakdown wasn't just about violence. It was also about the loss of hope. The people who gave up hoped they died, not because the winter killed them, but because they stopped fighting. They let themselves go. They lay down in the cold and waited for the end. It was a kind of suicide, a surrender to the darkness. Part 37, The Madness of the Snow. Winter Psychosis lets explore the madness in more detail, because the medieval winter didn't just break bodies, it broke minds. The darkness, the cold, the hunger, the isolation, they all combined to create a psychological pressure that was almost unbearable. The mind, deprived of stimulation and comfort, would twist and crack and shatter. The monks, as I've mentioned, were particularly vulnerable. They lived in isolated monasteries, cut off from the world, and in the winter they were trapped. They'd spend months in silence, fasting, praying, meditating. The darkness, the cold, the loneliness, they all took their toll. The monks would have visions, hearing voices, seeing angels and demons. They'd become obsessive, fixating on tiny details, repeating the same prayers over and over. They'd starve themselves, thinking they were purifying their souls. They'd cut themselves, thinking they were punishing their bodies. They'd go mad, utterly and completely mad. And the peasants, too, had their own forms of madness. They'd become paranoid, thinking that their neighbors were plotting against them. They'd become delusional, thinking that they were kings or queens or saints. They'd become violent, attacking their own families. The village would be filled with the mad, wandering the streets, muttering to themselves, staring at nothing. And the villagers, who didn't have the vocabulary to understand mental illness, would see the mad as cursed, possessed, demonic. They'd perform exorcisms rubbing holy water, praying, casting out the demons. But the exorcisms never worked. The mad stayed mad, and they died, or they were killed, and the cycle continued. And there was a kind of madness that was unique to the winter. It was a madness of the senses, a hallucinatory state that came from the darkness and the isolation. The people would see things that weren't there, phantoms in the shadows, faces in the snow, ghostly figures dancing in the firelight. They'd hear things that weren't there, voices in the wind, whispers in the dark, the sound of footsteps on the frozen ground. They'd feel things that weren't there, a hand on their shoulder, a breath on their neck, a presence in the room, and they'd become terrified, convinced that they were being haunted, that the dead were walking, that the devil was coming for them. Part 38, The Wooden Cross. Faith in the frozen world. But amid all the madness, there was faith. Faith was the anchor that held the medieval world together. It was the thing that gave meaning to the suffering. It was the thing that gave hope in the darkness. The medieval people were deeply religious. They believed in God, in the saints, in the angels, in the devil. They believed that the world was a battleground between good and evil, and that the winter was a test of their faith. They believed that if they prayed enough, God would answer. If they confessed their sins, God would forgive. If they believed, they would be saved. And so they prayed. They prayed in their homes, by the fire with their families. They prayed in the church, in the pews, surrounded by the dead. They prayed to the Virgin Mary, to Jesus, to the saints, especially the saints who were associated with winter. Saint Margaret, who protected against cold. Saint Nicholas, who brought gifts. Saint Lucy, who brought light. They prayed for the winter to end, for the spring to come, for the sun to return. They prayed for survival. And sometimes the prayers were answered. The winter would end, the spring would come, the crops would grow, and the people would thank God for his mercy. They'd hold services of thanksgiving, and they'd bring offerings to the church. They'd give thanks that they had survived. But other times the prayers weren't answered. The winter would continue, the hunger would intensify, the disease would spread, and the people would wonder why God was angry with them. They'd wonder what they had done wrong. They'd confess their sins, they'd scourge themselves, they'd sacrifice animals and even humans, trying to appease a God who seemed to have abandoned them. And then there were those who lost their faith. They stopped believing in God, or they believed that God was cruel and indifferent. They became bitter and angry, and they turned away from the church. They called the priests liars, the saints frauds, the Bible a fairy tale. They cursed God and died in despair. Their souls, the church warned, would burn in hell for all eternity. Part 39. The endless night. The longest of the winter now. Let's focus on a single night. The longest night of the winter. The winter solstice. In the modern world, we celebrate this night with lights and feasts, cheer and joy. In the medieval world, the solstice was a night of fear and trembling. The solstice occurred around December 21st. On that night, the sun set early, around 4 in the afternoon, and it didn't rise again until almost 9 the next morning. The 17 hours of darkness. The 17 hours of cold. 17 hours of terror. The medieval people didn't understand the solstice. They didn't know about the tilt of the earth or the orbit of the sun. They just saw that the days were getting shorter, the nights longer. They saw that the sun was dying, retreating from the world, and they were afraid. They were afraid that the sun would never return. They were afraid that the darkness would last forever. So they took action. They lit fires, bonfires, torchlights, candles to encourage the sun to return. They held feasts and celebrations, trying to create a moment of joy in the endless darkness. They made offerings to the gods and saints, begging for light. They gathered in the church and prayed all night, asking God to save them from the darkness. And then, on the morning after the solstice, they'd look out the window and see the sun. It was weak and watery, but it was there. The sun had returned. The darkness was defeated. The winter was still raging, but the sun was on its way back. There was hope. There was always hope. Part 40. The price of survival. What it costs to live now. I want to talk about the cost of survival, because the medieval winter didn't just kill people, it scarred them. The survivors, the ones who made it through, were changed forever. They carried the winter with them, a cold, dark weight in their souls. The survivors were physically scarred. They had missing fingers and toes, frostbitten noses and ears, chronic coughs and lung infections. Their teeth were rotten from malnutrition. Their skin was blotched and scarred. Their bodies were weakened, their immune systems compromised. They aged prematurely, looking decades older than they were. They died young in their 30s or 40s if they were lucky, and the survivors were mentally scarred. They'd seen too much death. They'd watched their children die, their parents die, their friends die. They'd been through the madness and the despair. They'd been pushed to the edge of their endurance, and they'd looked into the abyss, and the abyss had looked back at them. They were haunted by the ghosts of the dead, the memories of the starvation, the terror of the darkness. They were, in a sense, broken, and the survivors were socially scarred. They'd been through a trauma that had changed them, and they couldn't go back to their old lives. They'd seen the worst of humanity, the theft, the violence, the cannibalism, and they couldn't forget. They'd seen the best of humanity, the compassion, the generosity, the selflessness, and they couldn't forget that either. They were caught between darkness and light, between despair and hope. They were survivors, but they were also victims, and yet they kept going. They had to. There was no other option. They had to plant the crops, tend the animals, rebuild the homes. They had to raise the next generation, teach them the lessons of survival, prepare them for the winters to come. They had to carry on despite everything. Part 41. The spring that came too late. And then, one day, the spring came. It came late, as it always did. The snow melted, the rivers thawed, the ground softened. The sun rose higher in the sky and the days grew longer. The green shoots pushed through the mud, and the birds returned and the world woke up. But the spring was bittersweet, because the spring revealed the full extent of the winter's damage. The fields that had been planted in the fall were dead. The animals that had survived were weak and sickly. The people who had survived were thin and hollow-eyed. The village was smaller, emptier, sadder, and there were the dead. So many dead. The bodies that had been stored in the church were finally buried in hastily dug graves that were little more than shallow pits. The funerals were held, one after another, for weeks on end. The survivors wept, and they prayed, and they mourned, but they also planted. They had to. The land was still there, and the land needed to be worked. They had to sow the seeds for the next year's harvest, hoping that the weather would be kinder, hoping that the winter would be shorter. They had to go on, because that was what you did when you were a peasant. You went on, you survived, you endured. And the spring was a time of renewal, yes, but it was also a time of reckoning. The survivors looked at each other, and they saw the damage. They saw the scars, the missing fingers, the hollow eyes. They saw the pain, the grief, the loss, and they realized deep in their bones that the winter had changed them. It had made them harder, more resilient, but also more bitter. It had made them more grateful, more aware of the preciousness of life, but also more fearful. It had made them survivors, but it had also made them victims. Part 42, the summer that was never enough. And then came the summer. The summer of the medieval world was a brief, frantic season of activity. The people worked from dawn to dusk, trying to make up for the lost time of winter. They planted, they harvested, they stored, they prepared for the next winter, the one that was always coming. But the summer was never enough. There was never enough time, never enough labor, never enough food. The harvest was never as good as it needed to be. The stores were never as full as they needed to be. And the people knew deep down that the winter was coming, and it would be just as brutal as the last one. So they worked. They worked until their hands bled and their backs ached. They worked until they collapsed from exhaustion. They worked because they had no choice. They worked because survival depended on it. They worked because the winter was a predator that was always stalking. And in the evenings, when the work was done, they would gather in the village square and talk. They'd talk about the harvest, the weather, the lord, the king. They'd talk about the latest gossip, the latest scandal, the latest tragedy. And they'd talk about the winter. They'd talk about the winter that had just passed and the winter that was coming. They'd compare stories, swapping tales of survival and loss. They'd laugh and they'd cry. And they'd hold each other. And they'd pray. They'd pray to God and they'd pray to the saints. And they'd pray to the winter itself, begging it to be merciful, to be gentle, to be short. They'd pray for the strength to endure, for the courage to face the cold, for the hope to keep going. Part 43. The Reckoning. Counting the dead now? Let's count the dead. Because the medieval winter wasn't just a natural disaster, it was a demographic catastrophe. The population of Europe, as I've said, plummeted during the late medieval period. The winter was one of the primary causes. In a typical winter, a village might lose 10% of its population. In a harsh winter, it might lose 20%. In a catastrophic winter, like the winter of 1315-1316, it might lose 40 or even 50%. And that's not counting the deaths from the Black Death, which came later and was even more devastating. The dead were everywhere. They were in the homes, in the streets, in the churches. They were in the fields, in the forests, in the rivers. They were the old and the young, the weak and the strong. They were the rich and the poor, the noble and the peasant. They were everyone. The winter didn't discriminate, and the survivors, the ones who were left, were changed. They had to rebuild their community, start their families, plant their crops. They had to do it all over again from scratch. They had to bury the dead and honor the dead and remember the dead. They had to carry the weight of the dead with them, always. Part 44. The legacy of the frozen. And so, the legacy of the medieval winter is a legacy of survival. It's a legacy of endurance, resilience, and strength. It's a legacy of community, compassion, and faith. It's a legacy of pain, loss, and grief. But it's also a legacy of hope. Because the people who survived the medieval winter, the peasants, the nobles, the kings, they didn't just survive. They thrived. They built a world that was bigger, better, richer than the one that had come before. They built cathedrals, cities, universities. They created art, music, literature. They advanced science, medicine, technology. They turned the frozen wasteland of the medieval world into the vibrant, diverse, exciting world we know today. And that's the ultimate lesson of the medieval winter. It's not just a story of death and despair. It's a story of transformation. It's a story of how humans, faced with the most brutal conditions imaginable, found a way to not just survive, but to thrive. It's a story of how the cold, the hunger, the disease, they all shaped us. made us who we are, gave us the strength to build a better world. So, the next time you look out the window and see the snow, remember the medieval winter. Remember the cold, the hunger, the disease. Remember the darkness, the despair, the madness. Remember the death, the loss, the grief. And remember the survival. Remember the endurance, the resilience, the strength. Remember the community, the compassion, the faith. Remember the hope that carried them through and the hope that continues to carry us. Because we are the children of the winter. We are the descendants of the survivors, and we have within us the same strength, the same resilience, the same hope. We have the capacity to face the cold, the hunger, the disease. We have the capacity to endure, to survive, to thrive. All we have to do is remember. Part 45. The scars that don't fade now. Let's talk about the scars. Not just the physical scars, but the emotional and psychological ones. The scars that the medieval winter left on the human psyche. Scars that were passed down through generations. Scars that still shape us today. The survivors of the medieval winter were traumatized. They'd seen too much death. They'd been through too much suffering. They'd been pushed too far, and the trauma didn't fade. It lingered in the shadows of their minds, in the corners of their souls. It haunted them day and night. It colored their perceptions, their beliefs, their behaviors. They became fearful. They hoarded food, even in the summer. They stockpiled wood, even when it was unnecessary. They built walls and fortifications, trying to protect themselves from the winter's assault. They became suspicious of strangers, unwilling to trust anyone who wasn't from their village. They became superstitious, believing that the winter was caused by demons or witches or the wrath of God. They became rigid and inflexible, clinging to tradition and ritual because it gave them a sense of control. And they became fatalistic. They believed that the winter was inevitable, that suffering was inevitable, that death was inevitable. They accepted their fate with a kind of resignation, a quiet despair. They didn't try to change the world. They didn't try to improve their condition. They just accepted it, and they endured it year after year. But there was another side to the trauma. The survivors also became resilient. They developed a toughness, a hardness that was almost inhuman. They could endure anything. They could go for days without food, weeks without warmth, months without hope. They could watch their children die and keep going. They could be beaten down over and over and still get back up. They were survivors in the truest sense of the word, and they passed this resilience on to their children and their children's children, and so on down the generations. We, the descendants of the medieval people, carry their scars and their strength. We have their fear and their resilience. We have their trauma and their hope. We are, in a very real sense, the children of the winter, and we have the capacity to survive anything. Part 46. The winter's deepest mystery. Now, let's talk about the mystery. Because there's something about the medieval winter that we still don't fully understand. Something that's hidden in the chronicles, in the bones, in the soil. Something that defies explanation. And what was it like, really, to live through a medieval winter? We have the chronicles, the accounts, the descriptions, but they're all filtered through the lens of the chronicler. A man who may not have been there, who may not have understood what he was seeing, who may have exaggerated or omitted or twisted the truth. We don't have the real experience. We don't know what it felt like. We don't know what it smelled like. We don't know what it tasted like. We can only guess, and the mystery deepens when we look at the archaeology. The graves are filled with bodies that show signs of malnutrition and disease. The granaries are empty, or they're filled with moldy grain. The houses are burned or collapsed or abandoned. The soil is full of the traces of struggle animal bones, broken tools, discarded pots. The evidence of the winter is everywhere, but it doesn't tell the whole story. It can't tell the whole story. We can't know the thoughts of a peasant, huddled in the dark, waiting for the sun. We can't know the fears of a mother holding her child, watching her die. We can't know the hopes of a farmer planting his crops, praying for the rain. We can't know the despair of a nobleman watching his kingdom crumble, his people starve. We can't know fully and completely what the medieval winter was like, and maybe that's the point. Maybe the mystery's the lesson. The medieval winter is unknowable, incomprehensible, unimaginable. It's a horror that we can't fully grasp, a tragedy that we can't fully understand, and we should be grateful for that. Because if we could understand it, if we could really know what it was like, we'd be broken, we'd be shattered, we'd be lost. The medieval winter is a reminder of how fragile we are, how vulnerable we are, how close we are to the edge. Part 47. The Invisible Survivors. We've talked a lot about the dead to millions who perished in the cold, in the hunger, in the disease. But let's also remember the invisible survivors, the ones who lived, but who are forgotten by history. The women, the children, the elderly, the poor, the marginalized, the outcasts. The ones who had no voice, no record, no legacy. The ones who, in a sense, never existed except for the fact that they did exist. And they survived, and they passed on their genes and their stories to us. These invisible survivors are the true heroes of the medieval winter. They were the ones who kept the community together, who cared for the sick, who buried the dead, who raised the next generation. They were the ones who endured the unimaginable with grace and courage and dignity. They were the ones who survived despite everything, and we owe them a debt. We owe them our gratitude. We owe them our respect. We owe them our remembrance. They are the ones who made our survival possible. They are the ones who kept the flame alive. They are the ones who, in the deepest, darkest hours of the winter, refused to give up. So when we think about the medieval winter, let's not just think about the cold and the hunger and the disease. Let's think about the people. Let's think about the women who kept the homes warm. Let's think about the children who grew up in the shadow of death. Let's think about the old people who passed on their wisdom. Let's think about the poor and the marginalized who struggled and survived. Let's think about the invisible survivors, the unsung heroes, the forgotten ones. They are the reason we are here. They are the reason we can face the winter. Part 48. The Message of the Frozen Earth. Now, let's look at the frozen earth itself. The winter didn't just kill people. It transformed the landscape. The snow covered everything, a white blanket that hid the scars of the land. The trees were bare, their branches skeletal. The rivers were frozen, their waters still. The fields were barren, empty of crops. The land was dead, but the land wasn't really dead. It was dormant. The seeds were waiting under the frozen ground for the spring. The roots were waiting. The sap was waiting. The life was waiting. The land was, in a sense, holding its breath, waiting for the warmth to return. And that's the message of the frozen earth. The winter is not an end. It's a cycle. It's a pause, a rest, a preparation. The death of the winter is followed by the rebirth of the spring. The cold is followed by the warmth. The darkness is followed by the light. The winter is not the end. It's the beginning. It's the beginning of the next season, the next year, the next generation. The medieval people understood this. They knew that the winter was part of the cycle. They knew that the spring would come, the crops would grow, the life would return. They didn't despair because they had hope. They had hope in the cycle, hope in the seasons, hope in the future. And we too can have that hope. The winter will come, but it will also pass. The cold will be harsh, but the warmth will return. The darkness will be deep, but the light will come. The winter is not an end. It's a cycle, and in the cycle there is hope. Part 49. The Final Truth. So here's the final truth. The final, unvarnished, brutal truth. The medieval winter was a nightmare. It was a horror. It was a tragedy. It killed millions, scarred millions, broke millions. It was, in every sense, a catastrophe, but it was also a teacher. It taught us the value of community. It taught us the importance of preparation. It taught us the power of hope. It taught us that even in the darkest moments there is light. Even in the coldest times there is warmth. Even in the deepest despair, there is hope. The medieval winter shaped us. It made us who we are. It gave us our resilience, our strength, our endurance. It gave us our humanity, our compassion, our love. It made us capable of surviving the worst and thriving in the best. So, the next time you face a challenge, a hardship, a crisis, remember the medieval winter. Remember the cold, the hunger, the disease. Remember the darkness, the despair, the madness. Remember the death, the loss, the grief. And remember the survival. Remember the endurance, the resilience, the strength. Remember the community, the compassion, the faith. Remember the hope that carried them through and the hope that carries us. Because we are the children of the winter. We are the descendants of the survivors. We have within us the same strength, the same resilience, the same hope. We can face the cold, the hunger, the disease. We can endure the darkness, the despair, the madness. We can survive the winter, and we can thrive in the spring. All we have to do is remember. All we have to do is believe. All we have to do is hope. And so, we come to the end. We come to the final, quiet, peaceful conclusion. The medieval winter is over. It's behind us, but its legacy lives on in us, in our culture, in our history. We carry the scars and the strength of our ancestors. We carry the hope and the despair. We carry the winter in our bones, in our blood, in our souls. And we are ready. Ready for the next winter. Ready for the next challenge. Ready for the next crisis. Because we are the children of the winter. We are the survivors. We are the ones who will endure. The winter is coming, but so is the spring. The darkness is falling, but so is the light. The cold is descending, but so is the warmth. We are the children of the winter, and we will survive. Part 50, The Last Snowflake. And now, let's end with an image. A single snowflake falling through the dark sky. It drifts down, slowly, gently, landing on the frozen ground. It joins the other snowflakes, the millions of snowflakes, the billions of snowflakes. It covers the world in white. It covers the bodies, the homes, the churches. It covers the fields, the forests, the rivers. It covers everything. And then it melts. The spring comes. The sun rises. The snowflake, which was once part of the winter, becomes part of the spring. It flows into the rivers, into the streams, into the soil. It becomes part of the cycle. It becomes part of the world. And the world goes on. The people go on. The seasons go on. The cycle continues endlessly. The winter comes and goes. The spring comes and goes. The summer comes and goes. The autumn comes and goes. And then the winter comes again. It's a cycle. It's a pattern. It's a rhythm. And it's beautiful in its own way. The cold, the hunger, the disease, they're part of the cycle. The darkness, the despair, the madness, they're part of the rhythm. The death, the loss, the grief, they're part of the pattern. But so are the warmth, the food, the health. So are the light, the hope, the sanity. So are the life, the love, the joy. They're all part of the cycle. They're all part of the rhythm. They're all part of the pattern. And we, the children of the winter, we are part of it too. We are part of the cycle, the rhythm, the pattern. We are part of the world, and the world is part of us. We carry the winter in our souls, and we carry the spring in our hearts. We are the survivors. We are the endure. We are the ones who will always, forever make it through. The last snowflake falls, and then it melts, and then the sun rises, and then the world is born again, and we are born again with it. The medieval winter is over, but we are still here. We are still surviving. We are still thriving. We are still hoping. And so our long winter's journey comes quietly to an end. Tonight, we've walked snow-covered village paths, warmed our hands beside a crackling hearth, and shared the long, dark months with ordinary people who faced each winter with little more than hard work, careful planning, and hope that spring would eventually return. For them, winter wasn't simply a season. It was something to endure. Every loaf of bread mattered. Every piece of firewood mattered. Every warm blanket, every candle, every small meal was a quiet victory against the cold. History often remembers the castles, the kings, and the battles. But for most people, survival depended on much simpler things. A warm fire, a sturdy roof, kind neighbors, and the comfort of gathering close with the people they loved. As you settle a little deeper beneath your own blanket tonight, perhaps you can appreciate those simple comforts just a little more. The fire burns lower. The wind outside grows softer. The snow continues to fall, peaceful and unhurried. And just as another medieval night slowly slips into silence, you can let this stage and key fade away as well. If sleep has already found you, let it carry you wherever peaceful dreams may lead. And if you're still listening, there's no need to rush. Simply rest. Thank you for spending part of your evening here on *, the Sleepless Storyteller. If you'd like to wander through more quiet corners of history together, I'll be here whenever you're ready. Until next time, sleep well, stay warm, and may your dreams be peaceful. Good night.